The wind was a thief. It stole the heat from the thin glass of the window panes and the memory of warmth from the planks of the floorboards. For 2 days, it had howled across the plains, a malevolent spirit intent on scouring the world clean, leaving nothing but frozen earth and bone. Elara sat at her small table, the light from a single tallow lamp pushing back a meek circle of defiance against the encroaching dark. The silence in the cabin was deeper than the snowdrifts piling against the door. It was the hollowed-out space her husband, Jacob, had left behind. A silence so profound it had its own sound, the frantic beat of her own heart against her ribs. She was measuring her existence in spoonfuls of flour and single logs for the stove. Survival had become a grim arithmetic of subtraction. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white. Inside, her loneliness was just as vast, just as cold. It was in this frozen solitude that the sound first came. A frantic, desperate pounding on the door, nearly lost in the shriek of the gale. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. No one traveled in a storm like this. No one sane. She froze, her hand hovering over the worn wooden table. The pounding came again, louder this time, insistent. It was the sound of a man at his absolute end. Her mind raced with stories of desperate men, of drifters driven mad by winter. Jacob had always said her heart was too soft for this land. It will get you killed, Elara. She rose, her movements stiff, and took the heavy iron poker from its place by the stove. She held it tight, the cold metal a poor substitute for the weight of Jacob's rifle, which she knew how to use but prayed she would never have to. She moved to the door, her breath misting in the air. "Who's there?" Her voice was thin, swallowed by the storm's roar. A muffled groan was the only answer, followed by a slumping sound against the wood. He was not asking for entry anymore. He was collapsing against it. This was not the sound of a threat. It was the sound of defeat. Hesitantly, her fingers trembling, she drew back the heavy bolt. The door swung inward with a blast of ice and snow, and the man fell with it, spilling onto the floor in a heap of worn canvas and frost. He was a specter, his face gaunt and chapped raw, ice clinging to his eyebrows and the rough stubble on his jaw. He looked broken, as if the wind had stripped him down to his very marrow and found nothing left to take. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his movements agonizingly slow. His eyes, sunken in bruised hollows, found hers. They held no menace, only a raw, animalistic desperation that transcended pride. He did not ask for warmth, for food, for himself. He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a small, empty tin can, its edges rusted. He held it out to her, his hand shaking violently. His throat worked, but only a dry rasp emerged. He tried again, forcing the word past frozen lips, a prayer torn from the depths of his soul. "Milk," he whispered, the sound barely audible. "For the babe." Elara's gaze followed his nod toward the doorway. There, half buried in the swirling snow, was a crude sled fashioned from branches. On it, wrapped in a pitiful collection of rags and a threadbare blanket, was a small, still bundle. A child. The stakes, which had been her own lonely survival, suddenly shifted, expanding to encompass a life she hadn't known existed a moment before. The poker in her hand suddenly felt foolishly heavy. The bleak arithmetic of her own existence was shattered by a plea that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with a shared, fragile humanity. She looked from the man's desperate eyes to the still form in the snow, and a promise began to form in the quiet, desolate chambers of her heart, long before her lips gave it voice. The storm did not break. It settled in, a besieging army of wind and ice, locking the world in its grip for 3 days. The man, he had told her his name was Silas, slept in the barn. She could not bring herself to have a stranger in the house, not yet, but neither could she cast him and the child back into the blizzard's teeth. She had given him her last can of condensed milk, 2 of her thickest quilts, and a lantern. It was more than she could spare, and she knew it. On the first morning, she'd bundled herself against the cold and carried a pot of thin oat gruel to the barn. The air inside was frigid, but the great, shuddering body of her milk cow, Bess, lent a small pocket of animal warmth to the space. In a cleared-out stall, Silas had fashioned a nest of hay. He was awake, sitting with his back against the rough-hewn wood, the quilts wrapped around him and the child, who was nestled against his chest. The little girl, Lily, he'd called her, was impossibly small, her face pale but her breathing, thank God, even. He did not speak as Alara approached, only watched her with those haunted, wary eyes. He looked like a wolf cornered, ready to defend his cub to the death. She set the pot down and retreated a few paces, giving him space. He waited until she was near the barn door before he moved, pouring the gruel into a small wooden bowl and patiently, gently, spooning the thinnest part of the broth between the child's lips. Only when Lily had taken what she could did he eat himself, devouring the rest with a hunger that was painful to watch. He said nothing of thanks. His gratitude was etched in action. Later that day, she heard a rhythmic thumping from the barn and saw he had found a loose shutter and was methodically hammering it back into place with a rock, shielding them from the worst of the wind. The next day, he used Jacob's spare axe, which he'd found by the woodpile, to break down a dead limb that had fallen near the barn, methodically chopping it into firewood and stacking it neatly against her lean-to. They existed in a silent compact. He worked for their keep, mending things she had let fall into disrepair, his movements economical and purposeful. He reinforced a section of fence line bowed by the snow. He rehung the heavy door to the root cellar. He cleared a path from the cabin to the well. Each completed task was a sentence in a conversation they were not having. I am not a burden. I have value. I am earning this. And Alara, in turn, would leave food on a stump by the barn door, a small loaf of dark bread, a bowl of potato stew, a jar of precious apple preserves she had been saving. She watched him from her window. She saw the tenderness with which he cared for his daughter, rewrapping her in the quilts, murmuring to her in a low, soothing voice that was lost to the wind. She saw the profound weariness in his shoulders, but also the unyielding core of resolve that kept him moving. He was a man whittled down to a single purpose, his child. The trust between them grew not in words, but in the spaces between them, in the shared understanding of the harshness of the world and the simple necessity of work. Her initial fear of him had long since evaporated, replaced by a quiet, cautious respect. The silence in her cabin felt different now. It was no longer the sound of absence, but the sound of anticipation. She found herself listening for the steady chop of his axe, a rhythm that spoke of presence, of another life weathering the same storm. When the snow finally stopped and a weak, watery sun broke through the clouds, the world was a transformed, pristine landscape of white. It was on that day that Mr. Gable came. He owned the general store in town, and his visits were never merely social. He rode up on a stout horse, his face ruddy from the cold, his eyes taking in the freshly cleared path and the neatly stacked wood. His gaze, sharp and assessing, missed nothing. "Quite a storm, Alara," he said, dismounting. He carried a small crate of provisions she hadn't asked for. "Figured you might be running low." "I'm managing, Mr. Gable." His eyes slid past her, toward the barn, where a thin curl of smoke rose from a small, contained fire Silas must have built. Gable's smile was thin, proprietary. He had made no secret of his desire to buy her land since Jacob's passing, certain a lone woman would eventually fail. "Managing well, it seems. Got yourself some help?" The question was casual, but it carried the weight of accusation. In this small, tightly wound community, a woman alone with an unknown man was a scandal waiting to happen. "A traveler." The storm caught him. Alara's voice was clipped. "A traveler," Gable repeated, savoring the word. He set the crate down on her porch. "You must be careful. A woman on her own. People will talk. It's not proper. It's not safe." His words were a veneer of concern over a core of naked threat. He was not just a merchant. He was the self-appointed guardian of the town's cruel proprieties, and he was telling her that her small act of compassion had made her vulnerable, not just to the elements, but to judgment. He looked from her to the barn again, and in his eyes, she saw not concern, but calculation. He was already leveraging her predicament for his own gain. A fragile peace had settled over the homestead. The worst of the winter seemed to have passed, giving way to days of brilliant, cold sun. Silas and Lily remained in the barn, but the invisible wall between it and the cabin had become more permeable. He no longer waited for her to retreat before collecting the food she left. Sometimes their hands would almost touch as she passed him a bowl of stew. He would give a short, formal nod, but his eyes would hold hers for a beat longer each time. She learned the cadence of his days, the morning chores, the quiet hours he spent with Lily, the careful work of checking the snares he'd set at the edge of the woods. His presence had become a fixture, a quiet constant against the vast and unpredictable landscape. Alara found a strange comfort in it. The cabin felt less empty, the nights less menacing. That comfort was shattered when Mr. Gable returned, this time not with a pretense of charity, but with the stark lines of a contract in his hand. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Alara," he began, his tone falsely magnanimous, "I've been thinking about your situation. It's untenable. The town council agrees. A woman alone harboring a vagrant." He let the words hang in the air, thick with insinuation. "I'm prepared to make you a fair offer for this land, enough to get you back east to family. It's the Christian thing to do." The paper he held out was an insult. The price he offered was a fraction of the land's worth. It was the price one offered to someone with no other choice. Her hands clenched at her sides. All the work, Jacob's sweat and blood soaked into the soil, her own solitary struggle. He thought he could purchase it all for a pittance, using her compassion as the leverage to pry her from her home. "The land is not for sale, Mr. Gable." Her voice was low but steady, fortified by a surge of defiance she hadn't known she possessed. Gable's benevolent mask dropped. His face hardened, the avarice in his eyes undisguised. "Don't be a fool. You have no one. That man in your barn, he's a drifter, a nothing. He can't protect you. In fact, his presence here is what will ruin you. Sign the paper or I'll see to it the council has you removed. For your own safety, of course." "Get off my property," she said, the words as cold and hard as river stones. He stared at her, genuinely surprised by her resistance. A cruel smirk twisted his lips. "I'll be back, Alara, and I'll bring men to help you pack." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving a trail of threats lingering in the cold air. 2 days later, he made good on his word. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow when they arrived. Gable was not alone. He was flanked by 2 men Alara recognized from town. Men who worked for Gable, whose loyalty was bought and paid for. They were large, hard-faced men, and they carried no packing crates. Alara saw them from the window and her blood ran cold. She bolted the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of Jacob's rifle, heavy and unfamiliar on its hooks above the hearth. Silas was mending the handle of a shovel near the woodpile, his back to the approaching riders. He did not seem to notice them until they were nearly upon him. He straightened slowly, the shovel held loosely in one hand. He was thinner than Gable's men, worn by hardship, but he stood with a rooted stillness they lacked. He had regained some of his strength over the past weeks. The gaunt desperation had been replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. "Afternoon, Silas," Gable sneered, using his name with a familiarity that was meant to demean. "Time for you and the child to move on. The lady is selling the property." Silas's gaze flickered from Gable to the cabin door, where he knew Alara was watching. He said nothing. His silence was more unnerving than any threat. "We're here to help Mrs. Coulson with her things," one of the hired men said, taking a step forward. "So you can just get out of the way." Silas did not move. He simply shifted his weight, planting his feet firmly in the snow. He was no longer just a man in a barn. He was a sentinel. He stood between them and the cabin, a silent, immovable object. "She ain't selling," he said, his voice low and flat. It was the first time Alara had ever heard him state a claim on this place. Gable laughed, a short, ugly sound. He thinks he has a say. Get him. The two men moved forward. They underestimated him. They saw a starved drifter, not a man who had survived the unsurvivable, a man who had nothing left to lose and one thing to protect. What happened next was not a brawl. It was a testament to brutal efficiency. The first man threw a clumsy punch. Silas deflected it, using the man's own momentum to send him stumbling face first into the woodpile. The second man came at him with a grunt, and Silas met him with the handle of the shovel, a swift, hard strike to the knees that sent the man down with a cry of pain. It was over in seconds. Silas stood, breathing evenly, his eyes fixed on Gable. The broken man who had collapsed on Alara's doorstep was gone. In his place stood someone forged in the crucible of loss and hardship, his will as unbending as winter iron. Gable stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had come for an easy victory over a helpless woman and had met a wall he could not breach. Humiliated and outmaneuvered, he gathered his groaning men, cast one last venomous look at Silas, and retreated, his threats dissolving into the vast, indifferent twilight. The silence that descended in the wake of their departure was heavy, charged with the aftermath of violence and the gravity of what had just passed. Alara unbolted the door, her hands still shaking. Silas stood by the woodpile, his chest rising and falling, the shovel still held in his hand. He looked up as she stepped onto the porch, his eyes searching her face. There was a thin trickle of blood from a cut above his eyebrow where the first man's ring must have caught him. Without a word, she went back inside and returned with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. She motioned for him to sit on the porch steps. He hesitated for only a moment before obeying, setting the shovel aside. The cold evening air was sharp against her skin as she knelt before him. She dipped the cloth in the water, her touch gentle as she cleaned the cut. The simple act felt momentous, a crossing of a boundary that had been tacitly respected for weeks. His skin was cold, rough. He did not flinch, but she felt the tension in his shoulders as she worked. He smelled of pine smoke, cold air, and effort. "He'll be back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. Silas replied, his own voice low and rough. "But not tonight." She finished cleaning the wound and looked at him, really looked at him in the fading light. The wary guard in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something deeper, a shared understanding. They had faced a threat together and in doing so had become something more than a proprietor and a tenant, more than a rescuer and a survivor. "My wife," he began, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "She took sick with a fever just past the Platte River. There was nothing I could do. Buried her myself. I was trying to get Lily to her people in Oregon. I sold the wagon, then the oxen, walked the last 100 miles. We hadn't eaten in 3 days when I saw the light from your window." He spoke in a flat monotone, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else, the pain worn smooth by retelling it only to himself. "I was done. The storm was the end of it. Then you opened the door." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes clear and direct. "You gave us more than milk, Alara." The name on his lips was familiar yet new. He had never used it before. She saw it all then, the entire crushing weight of his journey, the desperation that had driven him to her door, and the unshakable resolve that had kept his child alive. The promise she had felt in her heart that first night had been a simple one, to offer shelter from a storm. But promises, she was learning, were living things. They grew and changed. She looked past him, through the cabin door to the hearth, where a small bundle of quilts lay in the wooden cradle Jacob had built. Lily was inside, safe and warm. This cabin, this land, it was no longer just her inheritance of sorrow. It was a sanctuary they had defended together. It was theirs. "The winter is not yet over," she said, rising to her feet. It was not a statement of fear, but of fact, a recognition of the long road still ahead. Silas stood as well, his height a solid presence beside her. He met her gaze, and the last of the distance between them seemed to dissolve in the twilight. "We will see it through," he said. It was not a question. It was not a request. It was a new promise, spoken into the cold air, sealing a fate that had begun with a desperate plea for milk. They were no longer two solitary souls adrift in a harsh world. They were a partnership forged in a blizzard, bound by a shared defense, and facing the future as one. As Alara turned to go inside, leaving the door open for him to follow, she felt the quiet, hollow space in her heart begin to fill, not with the memory of what was lost, but with the resilient, unadorned hope of what was being built.